Welcome again to the second Portuguese Symposium on Philosophy and Artificial Intelligence. We're talking about being human in the age of artificial intelligence. I hope you had time to have lunch and enjoy a little bit of oxyt. And we'll continue this symposium by talking about neuroscience. For the second keynote, I give the floor now to Miguel Castelo Branco. He is director of Coimbra Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Translational Research.
Just a bit of water. So, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in this interdisciplinary venue to talk a little bit about neuroscience, consciousness, and AI. In fact, I use more the term visual awareness than consciousness, and I will try to illustrate in which sense my research in neuroscience may relate or not to these fields. Okay, I will start. So yesterday I was in a forensic science conference, and people were asking me, can we already do brain reading techniques using AI to scan for forensic evidence? So it's a question maybe I leave for the discussion because I don't want to talk about that, although we could. And just to tell you that I work a lot with things that relate to dilemmas. So we recently had a project with firefighters where we were looking at deontologic life-saving dilemmas. So when we talk about consciousness and the contents of consciousness, we also think about decision-making, values. And so I address the contents of consciousness from the point of view of decision-making in many contexts, not just biological vision, but even like dilemmas like I show here. So here, the firefighters, they had to decide, it was a virtual scenario, a house burning with a given percentage of collapsing, with people inside with a given probability of dying, and they had an ethical dilemma. Should I enter or should I not enter? And the brain regions that are very much evoked to be involved in awareness are also related to this sort of ethical decision makings, the value of life. And so we need to think about the brain, what these brain regions are doing. And it's very interesting to see that the brain regions that are related to empathy, and brain regions that are related to empathy are very much related to meditation and changed states of consciousness. It's very interesting that they are activated when lives are saved, when there are no victims. So I start from very complex paradigms, but now I go simple, and I go to vision, because that's where I'm actually I think it's tractable to think about the contents of visual awareness. So if you can put these movies running. So here you see an example of visual segmentation of surfaces, but they also can become integrated in the left because there is loss of transparency. And so we are studying how the brain integrates or segregates visual surfaces. So we are studying state transitions, if you want. And I just showed you two examples, one of integration on the left, another of segregation on the right. Actually, the one on the right can also be perceived as integration, so seeing one or more surfaces. And we want to understand how the brain switches between states. As we talk about changes in conscious states, which I will also address, first we have to understand what makes the brain transition between states. And of course, this may depend also on the visual history. And so that's something we are studying, a phenomenon called hysteresis that we all have in our magnetic cards. So our magnetic cards have memory because they retain magnetism. We call this positive hysteresis, okay? We are studying hysteresis in the brain, how the brain keeps these integration or segregation processes, okay? And there are two types of hysteresis, positive and negative. In physics, positive hysteresis was described for many, many, many years, and recently people started talking about negative hysteresis. Negative hysteresis is when your mental states change faster than what be predicted, okay? Physicists talk about habituation, physiologists talk about adaptation. But so in vision, you can really determine rules that determine transitions between perceptual states. And that's where dynamic systems theory comes. And so I like to study vision and decision making from the point of view of these transitions in states, like people talk about transition in consciousness states. So it's very important to have operational definitions, and very famous scientists working in consciousness research like Koch, Christopher Koch, they use vision as a model because we can be more precise in the ways these states can transition. Of course, we would like to know how to make changes in visual awareness states. We have some methods. One method we have is brain stimulation. Here we can use brain stimulation methods to impose visual percepts or change visual percepts. So what I'm saying from the neuroscience point of view, we now have methods to mathematically predict transitions, state transitions, or to impose, based on an external stimulation, state transitions. And this may allow us to better understand what is visual awareness as a proxy to consciousness. Okay, here I show a stimuli similar to the one I showed you before, but now the stimuli is defined by color. Okay, I know philosophers love to talk about color and qualia, so I'm very interested in studying how color and motion are integrated, and I will explain you very shortly why. But first, let me illustrate again the concept of positive hysteresis. So here people perceive two surfaces, and if they persist for a very long time, we call it a memory effect, we call it positive hysteresis. Here the percept is fading very quickly, we call it negative hysteresis. And so we want to know, whether we can change these states. So we can do that, as I told you, using brain stimulation. So I'm giving you a very simple example of what people call, here you see that two surfaces are segregated. They are not bound, okay? But you can bind them, and then you see a single surface. With this stimulus, it's very difficult because the color difference and makes them really segregated. Is anyone seeing them just as one surface? No, I would not expect that, but when the stimuli are very small, you could integrate. So this is a very simple instance of what we call the binding problem. Okay, and the binding problem is a very discussed problem in cognitive neuroscience. How do we allocate the same object, the given properties to the same object? Okay, people that do programming, they allocate properties, you know, there are classes of objects, and then you allocate given properties to a given object. There is the question, how does the brain do this? How does the brain ascribe the correct color to the correct object? This is so controversial that many people say there is no binding problem. It's not, of course, my opinion. There are actually neurological examples where people do misbinding. They attribute the wrong properties to the wrong object. Okay, so we were interested. We have been doing studying brain oscillations. So we would like to know how the brain codes for disintegration versus segregation states. And this is an example. I don't want just to show you the techniques we can use. This is an example where we use magnetoencephalography. And you see, the pointer, okay. You see, we are studying basically two types of oscillations. The brain has alpha, beta, gamma oscillations. Beta and gamma oscillations are more cognitive. And you can see time zero is a perceptual transition when you transition from bounds in one surface to unbound. And you can see that upon the switch, there are changes in in the amplitude of these oscillations. And there is also a very interesting stimuli. People also talk, when they talk about binding, what about interhemispheric binding? So maybe I show, if you see this stimuli, you may see it as coherent, it's static. If the two sides are seen as separate, if they move, then actually we perceive an artificial phase offset. Maybe you can play the next movie. Here you see a single object, right? Unfortunately, the video with the separate object is not working. So our brain is binding across the two hemispheres, and we see a single object. So we use this very simple stimulus to study interhemispheric binding, how the two hemispheres communicate. But this stimuli, I don't know whether you can see it, sometimes it can switch, can also be seen as two surfaces moving one against the other. Can you see that? Probably not, because this stimulus favors more the integrated percept. Can you go to the next slide? It's not playing, yeah, unfortunately. But the next slide would be showing you this, either like a roof going down or two surfaces against one of the other. And you can have switches, dynamic switches in the two interpretations. So this means that we can have the two hemispheres seeing different things or seeing the same thing bound, okay? So these are very simple examples of state transitions. In this case, the two hemispheres being bound in the same representation or being separate in opposite representations. And if we see them separate, our brain constructs an offset. Although they are continuous, our brain makes them become discontinuous. So our brain is constructive. So this reflects very much the constructive nature of vision. Can you go? And so here I show you in a more clear, again, the same, back. Okay. Here I show you that there are really differences depending on whether we are talking about beta or gamma oscillations. So the beta oscillations, you see this transition, these beta oscillations tend to, the beta tend to stay preserved and the gamma tend to decay. It's them, I don't know what's happening. Can you move to the next slide? Okay. So this slide is again to illustrate the constructive nature of vision. Here you see an object that can only be seen if calibrated only through color signals because the luminance is noisy. And here is another example, a different type of binding problem. So if you have to find the object that is red and is square, you have to bind two attributes, okay? And the literature has shown that when you have to bind more than one attribute, you search it in a serial way, okay? So we call this, the process is dependent on the number of objects, of the number of elements. So our brain cannot automatically find objects that have two attributes that have to be bound, okay? So this is another example of the binding problem. If all objects would be the same color but just change in shape, it will immediately pop out. And there we call it parallel search. The time to discover the object does not depend on the conjunction of two attributes. So here binding is a synonymous of conjunction. We identify an object by conjunction of properties, okay? And this is a very important problem to understand how the brain really constructs these representations. Okay, for instance, here I'm not showing a video, but if you have a collection of green dots moving downwards, you bind them by color, but you also bind them, you can also bind them by motion. So binding is a problem. I don't know, because I'm new to this community, I don't know how much binding is discussed in this community, but binding is certainly a topic of wide interest to people studying conscious perception. So here I show another example of binding. Can you put it running? Here you see a face mask that is bound by motion cues. We call this a structure from motion stimulus. So in a way, we are talking about coherence, how the brain creates coherent phenomenal representations. So I'm talking a lot about the phenomenology of perceptual decision, if you want. And so this is something I have in the basic neuroscience part of my career, I have been studying a lot. What makes the brain create coherent bound representations? Here is another example, very simple, a figure ground segregation problem. Here you can have a figure ground based on the phase difference, okay? So here you can barely see it because the phase difference is very small. And one thing we are trying to understand is what codes for this figure ground segregation process. What we found is when we talk, so figure ground segregation can occur based on two types of cues, phase difference or orientation difference. If it's phase difference, the phase difference is proportional to the amount of synchrony you see here. These are synchronization peaks between neurons. So neural synchronization is larger, the larger the phase offset. So it suggests that we have a neural code, like the amount of synchrony between neurons is coding for the phase difference, okay? And what about orientation? In orientation, synchronization doesn't matter at all. What matters is the number of action potentials, the number of spikes that neurons are firing. So we have here two different codes, a synchronization code for the phase difference and a rating code, a counter for the orientation difference, okay? So in a way, we are trying to understand the mechanisms that make perceptual states emerge, okay? And synchronization is very interesting because synchronization means a collective state, populations of neurons that are synchronous, encoding a given representation. So this was actually the theory of my PhD supervisor in Germany. He was invited in many neurophilosophy conferences to talk about these collective synchronous states, which actually brain oscillations represent, okay? So of course, the way he put his hypothesis is no longer valid, I would say, but oscillations represent collective states. And that's why we are interested in understanding these brain oscillations and brain synchrony. Okay, I had this slide in the beginning, very small, but now I would like you to tell me if you see any object. So there is somebody looking at this stimulus. What do you see there? Ernesto saw a face. So I guess many people are not seeing the object. I can tell you that this is a particular difficult stimulus, but for the conditions of this auditorium, they are easier. But so, there is light coming from the left side. Here there is a nose. Here there is the eye in shadow, right? Here there is a mouth. Here is the shadow of the left part of the mouth, okay? These stimuli were designed by a psychologist called Mooney. It's a nice name, Mooney stimuli. And they are used to study, again, holistic perception, how we create a perceptual representation. If you do not see anything, you just have sensation. If you see a face, a perceptual state emerged. And what is interesting, once you see the face, you will see it for the rest of your life. We call it a single trial learning, okay? Another example I can tell you, but not in perception, is aversive learning, you know? If you eat a given type of food that is really very aversive, one trial is enough. You have learned that you don't want it anymore. So there are types of learning, and this is one example. You learn one, if you can see the face, you will see it forever. If you are shown, again, these stimuli. So we use these stimuli to show what we call eureka moments, what we call ha-ha moments, where we discover a perceptual pattern. And so these stimuli I'm surprised that not many groups are using it. We are using it a lot. Are very interesting to study emergence of perceptual representation. Emergence of a content in visual awareness, of a content in conscious perception. Because, I can show you the next one. Don't run it yet. Do you see anything? No, it's difficult. We make it on purpose. Now please run the video. Maybe some of you will start seeing something. There is a head, right? So what is very interesting, why do we do the rotation? Because it's easier for our brain to create holistic representations if they are upright. Because then there is something in our brain that allows us to construct the whole representation. I see the head of a woman. So, and it's very interesting because we can measure from what angle people start seeing. As soon as it arrives to 90 degrees, the people that can see it, they start seeing it. So you need a projection to upright to see it. It's a very interesting rule. And actually we use this stimuli to study perception in autism. Because people in autism have a more focused, more detailed style of perception. And so for them it's more difficult to holistically see this stimuli. So I introduce another term, holistic perception, global perception. In fact, I call this type of perception holistic binding, okay? And this type of stimuli allows us to, here there is a point where you suddenly have an eureka, you find the stimulus. Allows us to study these eureka moments from the neurophysiological point of view. So that's what we have done. So basically we have to, of course, the visual cortex is involved, the cortical areas, because this is a visual stimuli. But then you have regions like in the insula. The insula is very important for decision making. It's a part of the brain where that processes ambiguity. And as soon as it's very important for the eureka moment. In fact, we had a project with the Department of Informatics Engineering in Coimbra on eureka moments for computer programmers to find a bug. And the insula is also involved in bug detection. So the insula is not processing visual information. The insula is processing the level of ambiguity and certainty and then says, there is enough evidence, you can decide. So it has different functions. And again, when you see the face, so here this is a time frequency plot, this is time, these are frequencies. We see that these frequencies around the gamma band between 40 and 60 hertz are stronger when people see an holistic percept. So people are trying to look for signatures of visual awareness, signatures of conscious perception. That's what we are trying to do. We are lucky enough to be able to record directly from the brain of epileptic patients because they need these electrodes to do surgical planning. And we can see that in different brain regions, at the moment of discovery, different oscillations patterns appear. Like, for instance, in the occipital cortex, you see oscillations between 60 and 200 hertz. In the anterior temporal cortex, you see lower frequency oscillations. So it's like trying to understand the sea. We have seas of oscillations, and we try to understand these patterns. And that's where I think AI will come. Because AI, people are using more and more AI to try to decode these patterns. We have been able to study all these classes of stimuli that I have told you, in particular neurological disorders. Okay, one very famous one is called Williams syndrome. Okay, it's a neurological disorder where you have no binding. They cannot see the structure from motion faces. They cannot see these three-dimensional objects defined by motion cues. So since this is not a neuroscientific audience, I will just tell you that we could pinpoint that the brain region that is involved in this integration is in the dorsal part of the brain, in the parietal lobe. So then there comes another theory of binding. One theory is that binding, coherent integration, is made by synchronization, long-range synchronization of brain oscillations. There is another theory that is not necessarily contradictory, which says we need nothing. We just need don't need anything special. We just need what we call visual attention. Okay. Now we had this famous episode in the Portuguese jail. There was lack of attention. Some guys evaded. So there was a scientist called Treisman that said we glue the properties of an object to the same objects just by attention. Okay, we have an attentional system in the brain that tells what properties belong to the same object. Okay, this is another theory. What we find here is not totally incompatible because the brain regions she claims are exactly the right parietal lobe. We have an attentional master in the brain, which is the right parietal lobe. So in this condition, it's very interesting in this disorder because they have on top we see that in these time frequency plots, these are controls. There is a lot of synchronization, okay, in the beta frequency range, but the patients have you don't see any pattern. So this was quite striking. I just show you the synchronization plots. In fact, they have good amplitude of these oscillations, but they are not synchronous. So there is some evidence that this oscillatory pattern may really be signatures of perceptual integration states. Okay, now I go to another model that we also study that is very interesting for consciousness. I guess some of you heard about the concept of blind sight, seeing without seeing. Okay, when you have visual loss, like people have visual loss, so this is a black part of the field, people don't see, so there is no conscious vision, but they process information in the apparently blind part. So that's why we call it blind sight. This is a whole field of research. So this means that information is being processed outside of awareness, and many people are looking for these pathways. What we call subliminal perception. I have some work also on that, like how do we subliminally process emotions? Okay, how do we subliminally process motion information? I would say that we need to process a lot of information unconsciously, because otherwise it would be a huge cognitive burden. But so there are many people trying to use the paradigm of loss of vision to separate conscious perceptions from subliminal perception. And nowadays in neuroscience, we have very good methods to study this problem, which is very tricky. Why? Because the frontier between awareness and non-awareness is not a single line. It fluctuates. So it's at a given moment in time, we say this stimulus is below the threshold for conscious perception. At another moment can be above. And so if you do an experiment, maybe you have evidence that information is being processed just because of the trials where the stimulus reached conscious perception. Do you understand what I mean? So this is a very controversial area of research. So controversial that the guy that coined the concept, Popper, if I'm not wrong, he just wrote on paper and went out of the field. And then other people like Story, because this is a very, very difficult problem to study. What are the limits of visual awareness? And if they fluctuate, how can we be sure that we are really tracking subliminal processing? Okay, this is just an example. I don't want to go too much in detail. We can impose doing TMS, so brain stimulation. So if I can inhibit this hemisphere in stroke, then stops inhibiting this hemisphere, and suddenly I have activity in the lesioned hemisphere. So what I'm saying here, that by using brain stimulation, I can induce intriguing perceptual states. Okay, And working in vision, we can do a lot because we can examine in quite detail changes in visual perception. Okay? And now, so I have been talking to you about different models to study binding. Okay? So far I talked about brain oscillations. I talked about diseases causing visual loss. I have not yet talked about psychedelics. We also, in our research, we also use psychedelics to change visual experience. I will talk a little bit about it. And I will talk also about visual representations in people that have visual loss. So in computer vision, you talk a lot about active vision, right? So what we found in patients is that if we show them a stimulus in the visual periphery that they don't have to do anything, just passive, there is no response, okay? But so here is passive. But if they have a task where they have to process the stimulus, there is a response. This is very interesting because this is top-down control coming from the attentional regions, okay? So if they need the information, they will try to recruit as much as they can from the deprived visual cortex. Again, showing, and I was not a fan of attentional process, but is really showing that we have a very powerful attentional system that is capable of amplifying visual information. And again, this may illuminate also the blind side controversy, because attention can override subliminal perception. So from complete absence or nearly absent response, if they attend to the stimuli, then the visual cortex starts responding. So this tells us that the brain can really allocate resources, okay? And for conscious perception. Oh, sorry, this I showed already. Now I spoiled my. Do you see anything here? You should see the fruits because I already showed them, right? When I show this to students, when I show this slide to students, normally they don't see the fruits. I show this to them to illustrate 2 or 3 concepts. One is the concept of visual attention. If the fruits are in the visual periphery, they will not notice unless there is a contrast cue, in this case, a color contrast cue, okay? And so contrast cue, so peripheral vision is normally outside conscious perception, okay? So this is a very important concept that people are often unaware of. So we are often unaware of the stimuli that are in the visual periphery, okay? And we have several studies on the role of peripheral vision in perception. In fact, sports people understand this very well. You know, they can do many things without even knowing how they do them and how they see them. You know, our vision for action pathway is very subliminal, okay? And so if we want to talk about the debate between conscious and unconscious perception, so object recognition in the brain, which is in the ventral part of the brain, is a conscious process. People call it the gnostic part of the brain. The dorsal part of the brain is relatively automatic, and most of what is processed there goes outside the realm of conscious perception. Now comes my quiz. I had said to some people that I had a quiz. Maybe it's not a quiz, but maybe it's a quiz for me. But I always ask these questions to my biomedical engineering students. What is color? And 95% of the time they tell me it's wavelength perception. And it's wrong. I tell them that it's wrong. And then I try to explain them, if it would be wavelength perception, we would be gone from the surface of the earth because we would not survive. Why? Well, I give the explanation, so I'm not asking, but I get less than 1% of correct answers in my classes. So I tell them that there is indeed a red apple, and everyone agrees that it's red, and the qualia may be different for everyone. and that the apple, in this case, is illuminated by sunlight, okay? And then I start saying to the students, the apple is red because it prefers to reflect red, okay? So this is the reflectance function of the apple. What arrives to the photoreceptors is this, okay? Still a lot of red because that's are the long wavelengths. But then imagine we illuminate with another light with a different spectrum. We again multiply by the reflectance function, but then what arrives to the retina is something completely different, okay, very different from this. But we still see the same color, okay? So the composition in terms of wavelengths is different, but we see the same color. Why? Because what the object wants to know is about the constant property of an object called reflectance. So color is the best definition is the reflectance of the object, okay? Because what we want to know from objects are their properties, and reflectance is a property, not the wavelength that it is reflecting, okay? It's like a constant size perception. I have the same size, regardless of if I'm far away or close to you. In your retinas, your brain might discount for the distance to compute my size. The same for color. The brain discounts for the illuminant to compute the reflectance. So color, in fact, is the reflectance of the object. And then I tell my students, to perceive color, first you need to segment an object. So it's impossible to have color perception in the retina because the retina does not recognize object. First, you need to identify the object to ascribe a property called color. And there are many studies actually showing, so if you separate the objects, like if you segment the objects, then color perception becomes different. Okay, so color is something that the observer wants to perceive as a constant property, is a constant property of the object. So you can illuminate a yellow banana without any yellow color and still perceive it as yellow because the brain compares the reflectances of different surfaces to extract the real surface. I also tell my students that neuroscientists and philosophers love to talk about color perception, but in fact we are the animals with the poorest color perception, at least compared to reptiles and birds, which have up to 5 pigments. Here I just show an example. Well, we don't need to talk about color, but here you have, this looks black, just because my brain is discounting for the illuminant, but if I remove the illuminant skews, you see that the same number of photons is coming from this surface. So what do I mean? Our brain is constructing representation, is making inferences based on the context. Okay, now I talk a little bit about psychedelics, because psychedelics are a very nice model to study changes in consciousness much beyond vision. Of course, we were interested in vision, you know, and I think vision is a good way to start having biological explanations for perceptual phenomena. Please let me know if my time is not good. Okay, I think I will make it. So I started doing this research, being interested in the perceptual effects of psychedelics, hallucinations. Okay, and there are some hallucinatory phenomena with psychedelics, like visual distortions, tunnel vision, atmospheric haze effects. So we decided to study the visual stimuli when people inhale DMT, which is a psychedelic that activates serotonin receptors. So we have techniques to map the visual cortex, okay? This is the primary visual cortex. Basically, we map the coordinates of the visual cortex. Like here you have the polar the angle, you know, like like red means 0, means the vertical, so 0 degrees, okay? So and then in the brain, this means that here I have this part of the visual field, okay? So I can relatively precisely map the visual cortex. I can actually map the resolution of the visual cortex. So with a concept that we call the receptive field. What is the receptive field? Is the window of visibility of a neuron to the world. It's like my glasses, okay? So a neuron only sees a part of the world. In fMRI, this technique, of course, is not one neuron, it's many neurons, but they only see a part of the world that we call that part the receptive field, okay? So we have a very simple question. Do the psychedelics enlarge these receptive fields? Do they change? Okay. So it's basically the larger they are, the less spatial resolution we have, right? It's like a camera. If you convert 5,000 pixels in 300 pixels, you lose resolution because they have coalesced. You know, the receptive fields become bigger. That means they are merging together. Okay, and we have. I can show you visually the effect. So this is a receptive field without psychedelic, and this is after psychedelic in the same person. This is not in the central vision, more in the periphery. You can see a dramatic increase in the receptive field, okay? So that was very interesting for us because it suggested that a very simple biological change can explain phenomena like people seeing blurred vision in the periphery and very sharp in the center. This could explain sharp tunnel vision. They are starting to lose the periphery and see sharp in the center. So in a way, like a hard scientist, we are trying to deconstruct why people see things with psychedelics to find the biological mechanisms underlying these states of consciousness or these states of visual awareness. This is just a graphic representation. This is the group effect. This is the effect in individual subjects. So you see that we can see this. So this is without and this is with psychedelics. The effect is more pronounced in the periphery. It's not that we want to explain consciousness, but we want to explain the phenomenology of perception, and with this understand better conscious perception and visual awareness. Of course, we have with these techniques we have access to the whole brain, right? And so we are studying brain connectivity, how the connections between different functional connections, the dialogue between different parts of the brain changes. Here we do some hallucination scales, psychological scales. So the blue ones are after psychedelics, like affect is increasing, percept, cognition, volition, intensity. So we study at the same time the cognitive and the phenomenology, the neurophenomenology of these hallucinations. But there are many interesting phenomena that we want to explain. For instance, this type of psychedelic generates the perception of entities. It's very interesting. People start seeing godlike figures if they are religious, you know. So this is why these types of psychedelics are used, for instance, in ayahuasca ceremonies where people drink the tea. And it's very interesting why with these types of psychedelics you see entities and not with other types, okay? And we think, it's still ongoing research, that it's because a part of the brain called the supramarginal gyrus, that is a part of the brain involved in what we call the theory of the mind. What is the theory of the mind? Is my theory about how your brain works. You know, we use a lot this theory when we are in parties. We try to understand the actions and intentions of others. We have our own mental representations of the others, so to speak, of the minds of the others. So this is very interesting because that's something very inherent to the concept of consciousness, like stated by Anil Seth, like the sense of self, okay? And with these psychedelics, you have the phenomenon of ego dissolution. So that's something we are studying. So we are studying the so-called theory of mind network. Okay, and we are trying to compare how the effects of psychedelics match this theory of mind network. Okay. Now, this is one more result about the visual hallucinations. We see a lot when people take these psychedelics, a lot of activity in the right parietal cortex. I'm talking a lot about the right parietal cortex. That's the cortex that is involved in attention and imagination. We call it imagery. So to me, looking at all these studies, a common denominator is there, like the right parietal cortex. The cortex that is involved in mental image production, like when I imagine somebody, and visual attention. Okay? Now I go, because I had AI in my title, just kidding, but what AI do we have in this research? So far, the AI we have in our research is mainly for biomarker discovery, discover patterns that can diagnose Alzheimer's disease, okay? So we are using AI a lot for that. And we build these machine learning architectures that I don't think there is interest in explaining what are the biomarkers, but we use in medicine machine learning architectures to try to diagnose Alzheimer's disease or to predict if a person a person with memory problems will convert to Alzheimer's disease. I'm just showing, then we compute the sensitivity curves. So AI is exploding in this field of diagnostic medicine. But I think it's coming also to this field. So we are using AI a lot for brain-computer interfaces. Why? A very simple explanation is that if you can decode brain states very quickly, you can give feedback. So we are working with neurofeedback. We are working with neurofeedback interfaces. Also with people from robotics. My main interest is not motor disorders. My main interest is cognitive disorders, using brain-machine interfaces as gamified devices to train some competences. I give you an example here. We are using this with autistic people. We are using a reinforcement learning strategy. So autistic people, it's also very interesting. People might think they have sensory or perceptual deficits. I believe more and more that they have attentional deficits. If they do not do eye contact and if they don't do face analysis, they cannot recognize emotions. But if we train them to attend to these features and train them to have motivation to recognize these features, then they learn. And so what did we design? A brain-computer interface where they have to recognize the gaze direction. So they have to look in the eyes, and they have to recognize the emotion by looking in the mouth. But we want that when these perceptions should be used for some action. So they learn a rule. For instance, if this guy is gazing to my right and is smiling, the face will appear on the right. But if he is sad, a face will appear on the other side. We call it antisacade. I don't know whether so the appearance of the next face will depend on the gaze and facial expression. Do you understand? So we are training them to do eye contact and facial expression analysis. And then we tell them, well, you just have to pay attention and see if the rule is wrong or not. Okay, and then we tell them, you are training a computer, an agent inside the computer to learn the rule. So actually the agent inside the computer is learning through the reinforcement learning. And what the feedback does the autistic people give to the computer? Nothing, just a signal. Because there is a brain signal called the error signal that we can read from the brain. And so the autistic people is by magic teaching the computer to learn the rule. And here you see the progress. Here you see the progress in one session. You see that the artificial agent learns until 100%. Here is learning slower and does not really reach 100%. And what signal are we reading from the autistic brain? we are reading what we call an error signal. So brain-computer interfaces, as you know, are starting to explode. And here AI will be very important because it will make this brain-computer interface more reliable. So here we are using brain reading to improve the reliability of brain-computer interfaces. But of course, you can use brain reading maybe to try to decode emotions or other things. We cannot use it yet in the court. But I believe this will come more and more. Of course, we should be cautious, but certainly the field AI, and there is Marco Simões, is working a lot on this. We are working a lot on this type of decoding methods. Of course, I was mentioning the signal we are reading is from EEG, is a very low spatial resolution signal. So we try to combine EEG with fMRI to try to understand where these signals come from. Okay? And when we do that, we do really a lot of signal processing to decompose networks in the EEG that we can also see in fMRI. So we are basically decomposing networks that correspond to different mental states. And that's very interesting. In our case, we want to use it for neurofeedback, but you can also use it to study conscious processes. Okay, Marco Simões actually used AI to try to find a biomarker in autism. So we were basically looking at brain signals to classify autistic brains. So that's basically what we were doing. And it was interesting that in some of these experiments, we asked autistic people to imagine faces with emotions. And again, it's the parietal cortex that is activated when they are forced to imagine. So imagination has a lot to do with conscious perception or the emergence of conscious percepts. Here are some of the algorithms that Marco used to decode between autistic and non-autistic brains. So blue are emotional faces, so the decoding reaches 90% with emotional faces, but it's still around 70% even for non-emotional faces. Okay? So this part is just to say AI is becoming pivotal in neuroscience research. It does not explain how the brain works, but can give us clues to pinpoint where these processes are happening. And maybe we can use AI to further access the neural correlates of consciousness. So I hope, I did not know this audience very well, so I hope that my message was the expected one. But this is certainly a very interesting field for me as a neuroscientist. And thank you very much for your attention. I don't know whether there is room for questions or not.
I think presentations, huge opportunity to me and I believe to us to learn about this, let's say, mysterious neuroscience world. Well, a question. Well, we know we've been imitating the biological neural networks since the 40s, last century, in the 40s. Today, well, we are in the heat of this imitation. We are talking about our deep learning neural networks. Some types of them are very famous, and for instance, with ChatGPT, we're talking about large language models. But in the end of the day, we are imitating. So it's inspired. Even what happened in the neuron, the way the work is, the biological neuron is working is replicated in the artificial neuron. So the action potential is replaced by sigmoids and so on. But let's imagine that we have one of these days the chance, and I believe that this day is not so far, to create artificial neural network with the same type of connectivity of our brain with some, even with more neurons that we have in our brain. So we'll be expecting to have a model that will work as our brain.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You know, I work a little bit, as you saw, with computer scientists and people from robotics, and there are projects where people try to do bio-inspired models. I give you one question. One thing I used to ask my students: why do we have an eye movement system? And the reason is because our retina only has resolution in the center. So to resolve an object, we need to move the eyes. But if our retina would be perfect everywhere, with foveas everywhere, we wouldn't need an eye movement system. So our system is shaped by evolution. And as we study, I study a lot vision, we find many imperfections. Once I had a student telling me, your slide is wrong. I liked very much that he said this, that I had done some mistake in my slide because the light was traversing the retina before reaching the photoreceptors. So we have a very bad design problem in the retina that it's solved in the fovea because the photoreceptors then are bent. The cells are bent and then the light reaches directly the photoreceptors. But we have many faults, design faults in biological vision. And of course, if we would have a perfect camera, a fovea everywhere, our brain would have to be huge. So for me, it's very interesting to have, because I'm a neuroscientist in the end, so for me, bio-inspired models are very interesting, just as a concept, but we have to take into account that many things that are in biological systems were shaped by a faulty trial and error evolution process. So, but what we like to see something that resembles us, you know. So I think bio-inspired will always be there, and I think it's inspiring because nature finds very elegant mechanisms at the same time.
Thanks, Miguel, for the great talk. Very inspiring and out of my field, but try to learn a little bit. So I would like to ask you, as a neuroscientist, you were talking about the brain, and we were seeing images of the brain. This morning we were talking about, I was listening about, we were discussing about the conscious being whole body and not only brain and
yeah, brain-body interactions. Yeah. Yeah, people, it's also not entirely my field, but people are now, we have an interoceptive brain, the insula. The insula looks at the body. So that's also very interesting. Our brain evolved to look at the body signals. This started more than 100 years ago with William James. Some people take this to the extreme. Now I'm being a bit blasphemic. But the idea was there with Williams, that like the somator marker hypothesis. So we have a visceral brain that really reads the body. And of course, when you think about the sense of equilibrium, you know, our equilibrium depends a lot on vision, a lot on the vestibular system, and a lot on the joints. So you have to simultaneously integrate information from many sides to compute your static and dynamic equilibrium. So neuroscience is paying more attention to that, how the brain reads body signals, or even how feedback loops can abnormally increase, like anxiety. You know, like our brain senses an anxious body because there are visceral signals takes this as a cue that something is wrong, that the alarm system should go up, and some people can simply not control, and that explains anxiety, you know. So there are feedback loops between the body and the brain, and sometimes disruption of these feedback loops can create chronic pain. Like some people believe this is what happens in fibromyalgia. So I don't know whether I answered to your question, but our brain is set to look at the whole body, not in a brain-centric way. I don't know whether this is your question, but...
Thank you. You know, just a few moments ago, you used a very strange expression, for me at least, because you said that the brain looks at the whole body. I would say that we feel the body. Speaking about the brain that looks at the body, at least in my opinion, does not correspond to any experience that we really have.
It was just an expression.
Okay.
Just
Okay.
replace look by feel and it's fine. Of course, the brain
No,
feels the body.
that's not the same thing. Looking, feeling is different from looking, because looking means
Yeah,
some distance between someone who is looking and the thing that is looked at.
No,
and
I
feeling
fully
is
agree with
something.
you. Yeah, I fully agree with you.
Okay.
When I talked about the insula, I was, of course, talking about visceral sensation, which is not vision.
Okay. Okay.
But of course, we have an inner mental eye. That's what I meant. Not visual sensation. Maybe I should add to that we have a mental representation of the body that is supramodal. Okay, so and that's very important. So the parietal lobe, when I say the brain, when I was saying that the brain looks at the body, it creates a supramodal representation. So it's also not feeling. It's not looking, not feeling. It creates, and there are really regions in the parietal lobe that have this supramodal representation. Supramodal means that is independent of vision, haptic, or whatever. In fact, we have all types of neurons. We have neurons that are visual and tactile at the same time. So then we call them polymodal. Okay, polymodal is when they respond to visual and tactile. There are some neurons that only respond to mouth-centric stimuli. They are in the ventral intraparietal part. It's like for eating. It's a huge specialization. So they code the direction of movement. So they work in the coordinate reference frame, which is the mouth. Okay. So in the parietal lobe, you have coordinate space that are not centered in our brain, in our head. They are centered on joints. And that's where, when I mean look, is look in a metaphorical way, that we create representations of space that are either centered on a part of the body or are supramodal because they are independent from the modality. So this polymodal means when a neuron responds to different modalities. Supramodal means when the representation is independent from any modality. And for instance, now we can talk about out-of-the-body experiences. Okay, out-of-the-body experience, we are really looking at our body from outside. Just kidding. And it comes from lesions in the vestibular lobe or from electric stimulation in the vestibule. So why do people? It's very interesting. So we really have a part of the brain that represents our body in place. And disruption of these regions creates out of the sometimes, and it was also very interesting, this phenomena can occur if you have earthquakes. You know, so you have very abnormal input to the vestibulum, and then there are mass phenomena of out of the body, and people believe that they are in a massive, you know, religious experience, and nothing against, but this can be simply explained, but that very strong input to the vestibulum can create an out-of-the-body experience, which is an exceptional conscious experience, and that occurs very frequently in near-death experiences.
One more question. Here, to your left. Hello, good afternoon. Thanks so much for the presentation. I don't think you saw me yet. I'm here. Thank you so much for the presentation. I had a question regarding the experiment using psychedelics that you said that the common denominator was the right parietal lobe.
So I must say these data are still a bit preliminary, but the part on the receptive fields is published, but I'm pretty confident on these results. But yes, please.
My question was, what do you think about the traditional view of the role of the right and left hemisphere, and if the conclusions go along that vision or suggest something else?
Well, it's very known from the neurological literature that we have a master in the right hemisphere. So if people have a lesion in the right parietal lobe, they start neglecting the left part of the visual field. It's very interesting. They eat half of the plate, so they do not eat anymore the left part of the plate. It's also very interesting when we talk again about perspective or coordinate frames. These people can have neglect to the opposite part of the visual field. They are not blind. They just stop noticing. And then say, why didn't you notice? Oh, you're right, I didn't pay attention. So it's really an attentional deficit. What is interesting is some people have this in the left part of the visual field. Others have on the left part of objects. You understand? So like object-centered, we call it neglect. So it's clear that for some functions we have a clearly hemispheric dominance, like we have for language. For visual attention, we have it. And it's evolutionary. There is an Italian scientist called Valor Tigara, he's already retired, but still working, that say this started with chicks, that these animals have completely lateralized eyes. Primates, then they become frontal, okay? But somewhere during evolution, one hemisphere, because when eyes are lateralized, one hemisphere sees one part of the world, the other hemisphere sees another part. And simply by evolution, the right hemisphere of the cheek started being the one dominant for vision, if you want. That's the Valor-Tigara theory. I don't know whether any theory can be wrong. But for a visual attention, so if you have a lesion in the left hemisphere, the right can take over. Okay, so it's quite interesting. Like this is one of the strong lateralizations you can find in the brain. The other is for language. Like we also have an area in the brain for reading, called the visual word form area. You only find it. It's mainly in the left hemisphere. I don't know whether I answered your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay, obrigado.
So let's continue discussing now with roundtable 3. There's an important question. Can AI be creative? Let's try to find it out in this table. Artificial intelligence and creativity, with Amilcar Cardoso, Vinícius Aguiar, and Miguel Castelo Branco, again in discussion moderated by Vitor Santos.
welcome to this panel. It's about AI and creativity. So I have a pleasure to have in this panel 3 brilliant scientists that are working with, somehow they are working with creativity. Milka Cardoso from Coimbra University is software engineering, and he is working in computer scientist. And Vinicius from philosophy, he's working with music and creativity. So complete different perspective. And Miguel Castelo Branco, neuroscientist. So, well, for sure, 3 different views about creativity, and for sure about the possibility, let's imagine this hypothesis, that AI can be really creative and is not just remixing things that already exist. So let me start by asking you if AI can be creative or is just illusion, because in the end it's not being creative, just mixing apples and pears. So let me start with Amilcar. What do you think?
Okay, first of all, thank you for the invitation. This is very interesting. It's a pity that I cannot attend the whole thing, but that's life. That is an interesting question. I remember 30 years ago when we started working on this, the question was quite important for us. We were a very small community. But our thought was, and our argument to make this kind of research was, creativity is a characteristic of intelligence. It is a part of our intelligence. We cannot think on intelligence without creativity. If we are making research on AI, and we were making research on AI, we should also include creativity. So our concern was not to know whether a program, a computer could be creative. I prefer to formulate this way, not AI being creative. It's a computer being creative. If we believed it was possible, and at least it was interesting and useful to try to have our programs with intelligent characteristics, it would also be interesting and productive and useful to have our programs with creative capabilities. So for me, thinking on, is it possible to have creativity in a computer is more or less the same as having intelligence in a computer, okay? Maybe some people think, and I remember that there was a bit this counter-argument that there's the feeling that we are unique in something. When I was young, I remember some teachers, or some teacher, I don't know, telling me that the difference between us and the animals is that we are intelligent, they are not. We know this is not true anymore, okay? Maybe later on, we thought, okay, maybe it's creativity that is unique for us. It is not, because we know that animals are also creative. Some animals exhibit creativity. And even the nature in general exhibits creativity. The evolutionary process is a process of creativity, of creation and adaptation and so on. So this is not unique for us. So it is not a surprise that we try to make our computers more creative. Whether it is possible or not, at least I don't see arguments for not being possible. Okay, the same as with intelligence. And at least we can, in our computers, we can nowadays find ways of some exhibition of creativity, at least more basic forms of creativity, exploration creativity, for instance, using the difference that Margaret put it, Bowden introduced in the 90s, where exploration in creativity means explore a conceptual space and find interesting examples that can produce good answers, while transformative creativity means transform the conceptual space and find other stuff. At least in terms of exploratory creativity, nowadays it's quite possible to get that.
Okay, thank you. And what is your opinion about exactly the same?
Yeah, no, I think I can pick up from a professor just left, because I completely agree. And from a philosophical perspective, of course, like there's also a very strong tradition already of this creativity as being something more like spread in nature and in animals. I'm talking about that because while you were, I hadn't planned when you sent the questions, I hadn't thought about this example, but based on what you were saying, I was remember from Peirce, who is a philosopher that I studied a lot, who also wrote a lot about abductive reasoning. And he discussed this a lot on how, like, even in animals, you have these kind of creative leaps that, you know, like, so the idea that we are unique because you have creativity per se would not be such a strong argument. Although, like, for example, you can also then argue that the level of creativity that we have could be different or not, but, you know, that's another discussion. But where I think I could contribute more or add something to what you already said is that an important distinction to be made is between creativity, let's say, in general, or as an element of our intelligence, and how we behave and how we solve problems and so on, and a specific case which would be artistic creativity or creativity in the arts and so on, which is what I am studying more. My background is actually in musicology and then in philosophy, and because then we also have the same question, and then, okay, like, we're all, like, there's different levels of creativity in nature and in animals, etc., but artistic creativity would be something very unique from humans, for example. Like, there's also
Talking about music.
Yeah.
We already talked about generative AI. So let's imagine that you have generative AI composing a new music. Well, but it's the result of all the musics. So in the end, it will be new or be just a mix, like you are cooking and you are just mixing things. So in the end of the day, it will be limited to all the combinations that you can do. Can we talk about creativity?
Yeah,
The same.
absolutely. Yeah,
just
yeah.
to mix things is to be creative. Kind of randomizing. Be creative.
I think so, and
Okay.
the thing is that, like, again, the artistic or musical creativity would be one of these, you know, like, no, but this is what makes us unique because it's a very special type of creativity. But like, not only we do have examples now, like, you work with that, but there's also, like, even more commercial examples of how you can use computer systems in general, not only AI in the strict sense, to generate music. And but also one thing that, you know, I was thinking about it when you.
But let me to challenge again. So
Yeah.
let's imagine that you train your LLM with fado. Okay, then in the end you'll mix, but you have fado, you'll never get rock and roll. Or you have rock and roll starting from fado.
Yeah, but
It's not a limitation.
it could be a limitation, but then we have a different question that is, like, one thing is
Okay.
if you can use computers to generate music or not. And the other thing that I think it's actually the problem at stake is that how good this music can be. You know, like, when we discuss, like, you know, for example, can they surpass human musical creativity or artistic creativity? At the end of the day, what we are assuming is that, you know, like, we have a high standard of music or art than we can make, and then that this computer system might be as good or even better. And there I think it's more problematic, because there you reach, like, a more complicated thing, because it assumes that we can define very precisely what is our highest standards of art or music, etc. So we could compare, you know, like, that this thing that the computer generated is as good as the best examples that we have. And that's like a more complicated debate. So it'll be a kind of a matter of different degrees of creativity, or
Okay,
yeah.
that's interesting. But Miguel, how about our brain? Are we just, our creativity is our brain mixing things that are so a kind of a processing error? So we just have an error of processing because we are trying to pay attention to two things at the same time. And then, let's and then this is creativity, and that's the end of the story. How do neuroscientists think about creativity?
Well, this year there was a symposium in Bial on the neural basis of creativity. So neuroscience, and I remember very much an interview with Sting, the musician, and I was a follower of Sting. So he had very, very inspiring, creative moments in his career. And there are moments in his career where he complained the complete lack of creativity. So for me, this is resonant. When I think about creativity, so going a bit back, what are the criteria for creativity? Because people try to study this empirically. So it has to be novel. It has to be a creation, but somehow reaches a result that can surprise and where you can get pleasure. That's at least as a neuroscientist, as I see it. In fact, seeing patterns in noise, like the stimuli I was showing, and having eureka gives a huge sense of reward. So I think creative moments must have this element of reward and pleasure. Okay, and I believe, so now going back to the computer scientists, I believe that there can be computer-produced pieces that can bring this sense of surprise and resonance. That's the other concept because you always need a criteria for reward or pleasure. And there is actually a physicist in the Universidade do Minho. He studies color vision, and he's studying what makes people like an art piece based on color content. And what he finds is that the spectral composition of the paintings have to be the ones that are more similar to what we see in nature are the ones that give rise to larger aesthetical pleasure. So you know, in the end, what counts is the result. So I have no problem in finding when I mean result, is the result the impact that it has on the person that appreciates the result, like pleasure, hedonic pleasure, reward, surprise.
Would you say that there are some people that are more creative than the others, or it's just a trigger? We have different triggers, and as it is a cognitive process,
I would definitely say people are
supposed to be
different.
creative.
Like some people can be very creative in problem solving,
Okay.
like mathematical problems that can be solved in unusual ways. So I think there are dimensions of creativity,
Okay.
you know, and many aspects of artistic creativity is like being a very, very good soccer player. People cannot explain where it comes from. It's like instinct, skill. It's more like a skill that you cannot explain, you know. So I'm really thinking about brain structures like the basal ganglia. You know, what makes someone a person that makes nice drawings? Of course, you could say, well, that's just a skill, visual motor skill. Okay. Something people like, not everyone, but something that how to creatively represent an object with the few amount of traces, you know. So we as humans, there are famous painters like Miro, Picasso, that somehow there is consensus in mankind in general. So, and I believe that relates to the work I was mentioning of the color vision scientists, that there is something these people can capture from human nature. So in a sense, we recognize, at least neuroscientists recognize creativity as a human manifestation, but I believe that it's possible to create them using a computer.
Okay, thank you. Well, if you ask DALL-E, that is a generative AI, so to create, let's imagine a painting of Victor in the Picasso style blue face. And well, of course, probably the results wouldn't be fantastic, but for sure DALL-E will be able to produce that painting. So should we ask DALL-E to pay rights to the Picasso descendants and to me, or to be just a creation? So there is intellectual property in this AI. How do you feel? What?
Well, let's see. It's very polemic, that question,
Okay.
and I don't have a definitive answer to that. But I can think aloud about several aspects of the phenomenon. Well, first, a computer program is not a legal entity, so it doesn't have rights. Okay, nowadays with our current culture, because 14 or 4 centuries or 5 centuries ago, slaves had no rights neither. But nowadays, we don't have slaves, and all the humans have, in principle, the same rights. So I don't know what happens sometime, if there will be some time, any time where a robot may have rights, I don't know, or a program may have rights. If they have rights, maybe they have to pay taxes and so on. I don't know. But nowadays, what happens is that these tools belong to big companies, and the big companies don't pay anything at all. So if we want them to pay anything, we have to make some legislation to force them to pay. But even forgetting that, I think it's not crystal clear what is going on when we make a query to a current generative AI program. And I want to distinguish between the current generative AI programs based on LLMs and so on, and many other approaches that AI uses. Well, these programs have learned by seeing, let's call it this way, or analyzing thousands and thousands of images, thousands and thousands of paintings. They have listened, kind of listening, thousands of musics. They have read thousands of documents, of text documents, and they have learned statistical ways of computing the next piece of thing. And they are very good in joining that and making something credible, okay? But, well, the question is, what happens with a human? A human that paints, that finds his own style, for instance, of composing music or of painting. The thing didn't came from heaven. The human, to be able to do that, had to learn a lot. They studied in the school. They studied a musical composer. They have to study all the epochs of music. They had tried to imitate Bach, to imitate Mozart, to imitate Schoenberg, and so on. So they had to do that. To learn the technique.
But don't you
they
think
had
that
to
is
listen
also,
to
I
them.
agree, but don't you think that's also, even if you learn, there's not something that's intrinsic, that belongs to the person, because it's the art about
Yes,
the expression
yes,
of
it is true. But when we see an image produced by one of these programs, the question I put is, how can we determine exactly which were the images that were used to produce this specific picture? We can't.
We can't.
It's impossible. It's impossible. So I don't think it is possible in general terms. Maybe in some exceptional cases, we can find that this painting is too close to this known one, or maybe because the query asked that, okay? But in general, I don't think it is possible to trace, because we are dealing with black boxes, okay? So the only way of getting something from these programs to give to the original authors is to consider any kind of tax from these companies and distribute for the authors in general. It is not possible to ascribe, to identify a particular author that was used for that. Well, but that has to do with rights. Now, about the limits of what these programs have. They have strong limits. For instance, these programs don't have a model of the world. So they can't deal easily, and well, actually they can't deal with spatial distribution. In music, they can't deal with structure. If we ask one of these programs to produce music in a given style, the music is, we can recognize the style, but the program fights for finishing, for having some kind of structure, of narrative in the music that is being produced. The same with images. If we ask DALL-E or any of those programs to put a yellow box over the other, on the right of this and so on and so on, or if we ask them to do some kind of arithmetics, the system will collapse, will give rubbish at all. So there's a lack of a model of the world in these programs. Well, they have a model, but it's a model, a statistical model that doesn't address this kind of issues. If we want to address these kind of issues, we have to combine other techniques. We have to use knowledge-based systems or evolutionary computation and so on, but not just this.
This is a good point. So, but do we want creativity to be statistical? So it's just like, or do we want? So there is just a way to be creative in music. For instance, so there is no what it means to be inspired, because different musicians create different things. Of course, they can always say, "Oh, I'm inspired in someone," but in the end, they are different.
Yeah, it's interesting when we ask these questions about music specifically, because music has always been, maybe more than other arts, more rule-bound. More, like not only in the sense of the mathematical aspect of music, but really like that the techniques are in a way more easily converted into rules. I'm not saying that it can be completely converted, but so there is like this very strong relationship that learning to compose, you learn a bunch of rules, you learn counterpoint, you learn musical forms and so on, in the form of rules that do not depend on any sort of inspiration or anything like vague. It's quite precise. But then you have something like very peculiar that happens, that the rules of counterpoint are the same for everybody, but the counterpoint by Bach, it is superior to many other counterpoints that have been made, using more or less the same rules. So like there's a bit this thing that within a set of rules that maybe you can even convert into a computational language, there are choices that you can make within that some of them somehow become more interesting than others. It's difficult to say why, but this happens, and that's where this leap happens, that it is technical, it's a rule-bound thing, it is a counterpoint, it is something that you can learn, it is something that you can convert into rules, but you cannot really explain that easily why this composer played with these rules in this and this way, and that other one did it in another way that is not so interesting as the first one. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, then you can have all sorts of theories to try to explain that. There's of course, the idea of the romantic genius and so on, but yeah, it's just for me, what's more important about this discussion is that you have this, especially in music, you have this dimension that you can put in a computer system that they can manage, but the difference between that and a Mozart or a Bach or something like that, to stay with the very classic ones, is that somehow the way they use or adjust or make little exceptions to these rules here and there make things more interesting. And how did they get to those options instead of zillions of others? We don't know, but and this has something to do with structures, the
yes,
word, and
I think we are at the same page.
Yeah.
And I would like to add just another thing to this. Current generative AI, what we have access, is very good in producing technically perfect things. Because the technically perfect deals with local features. And these systems are very good in learning local features, but they have limitations in global features. That's why then they have difficulties in dealing with space, with time, and so on. In my view, these systems can be used and give some pleasure to the users, but it's a very limited pleasure in my view. And creativity, I agree with Miguel, creativity is something that has to produce pleasure for the author, okay? When we are in a creative mood, we feel a reward, okay? If we just press a button to listen something, okay, we have some aesthetical reward, but it's just that. It's like to play and turn on the radio and listen something. But at least in radio, we have good songs. Songs built with beginning, middle, end. There's some structure in these musics. In these systems, produced by current generative AI, what we listen is to, because of the characteristic of being statistical, and it is interpolating what the system learned, we tend to identify this music or these images as being AI images, AI music, because they are stereotypes. They are basically stereotypes. The same with text. If we make a very deep question to ChatGPT, the answer will be something like Miss Universe being interviewed. It's the stereotype of what people say. Okay, so I think this is the big limitation of current ChatGPT.
Yes, I agree. Let me. Yeah, sure.
2 points. One particular challenging thing about music is we as humans evolved with musical creation since early evolution. In fact, we have music in our language. It's called prosody. Okay, and so a big part of musical pleasure comes from communication, which is something very difficult for AI to achieve, because we emotionally resonate with. There is this famous spine thrill. Now I forgot the correct English name for it, but there are many aspects in music that are emotional, and the part of the pleasures comes from emotions. And I think that's the big challenge for AI, because music is communication. When we hear music, somehow there is a sort of communication. So this is one aspect that we see a lot in clinical neuroscience, because in some neurodevelopmental disorders, music is lacking from the speech, and then communication is gone. So music is a way to communicate emotions, and that's a huge challenge for AI. The other thing, just as a note, a bit related to what you were saying, is that actually I was involved in a PhD supervision regarding musical improvisation and playing by the script, so to speak. And so that's a huge field in neuroscience. It's not at all my main topic. It just was a side note in my career, but I find it very challenging. You know, so I cannot give you a neuroscientific. Of course, some of the papers suggest that in fact you need a lot of executive function, a lot of intelligence to be able to improvise. But when you see, like if you go to live jazz, you see that it works because there is communication. It was just 2 notes that
I would like to add just one note following that. When I speak about creativity in computers and so on, I always think on a human intervening in the process. That's why I think The emotional part will be in the side of the human. Okay, I look at computational creativity as a way of giving humans ways of extending their creativity, but the human has to feel as the owner of what he is doing. It doesn't. That's why pressing a button is
Art's
not
always been
not
technique
pleasure.
since for instance, the Impressionists. Art's always been technical, and maybe if you ask Gemini or ChatGPT something like, please write a romance about Alkshut to me, and you press the button, maybe your contribution as a human will be prompt engineering. So in that sense, well, it's a lot of technology to produce a romance. But my question is, it will be authentic. Can you put your name on, so you just made some prompt engineering, you ask a romance about Alkshut, then press, so it be authentic or it will be facts.
If I don't feel it as being produced by myself, I will not say it is authentic. Okay? To be authentic, I have to feel it as an ownership. It's mine. Okay?
But
if I just press the button.
You wrote the prompts, all the prompting for your romance.
Okay, if I wrote
So
the
it's a
prompts,
technical issue.
okay, that's different. If I wrote the prompts, or if I programmed something or made a program that does the thing for me, it's possible that I feel the result as mine.
Okay.
And in that case, it will be authentic.
All right.
That depends
share
on the
you have the
user,
same
of
opinion?
the human.
Yeah,
How the
absolutely.
human feels about it.
You all have the same opinion, right?
Yeah, I would just say that I think you can also think about this in different degrees, because of course the idea of prompting is a very new situation, but writing the program that would generate, for example, the music is not as new, not even as modern computers like you had in the 20s, or the Austrian composers like around Schoenberg and Berg and so on, that would write like serial. They were basically like matrices. Yeah? They were like doing multiplication of matrices before AI, yeah, quite literally. And the idea like to escape like basically the traditional tonal harmony of Western music, they were like trying to create other means for generating other kinds of sound combinations. And to do that, they would create these like mathematical matrices that would basically define the timbre, the rhythm, the duration, the note itself, and so on, and even structural aspects. And an extreme case of that was a piece by Pierre Boulez, in which absolutely everything of the piece, every single note was mathematically determined. So what he did is that he wrote the series, the computer program, so to speak, but with paper and pen. And the music was generated after that. And, you know, like, so there you have like more of this ownership, because he wrote the series, he wrote the, though we could also like, I try to distinguish between that kind of thinking, like a mathematical thinking, and a musical thinking, more in the tradition of phenomenology, as Professor Carlos already talked in the morning, but that's another debate. But this is one thing. The other thing is like writing a prompt. You did not write the program, you did not select a data set, you did not train that, you wrote a prompt. It's a different thing. Another thing is just like, as you said, you don't even play.
You just wrote the prompt to create your music.
And then it also depends on the prompt. It depends on, can I just give, maybe I'm already speaking too much, I don't know, but I just like to give this one.
We need to hurry up because we need to give
just
time
one
for
example, because I haven't seen people commenting about that. And a while ago, I think I commented this with Klaus. A while ago, there were like these examples of a fake AI cover songs. So like they would, the first one that I heard was like Soundgarden, like this 90s band, American band, one of their songs, but being sung not by Chris Cornell, that was the official singer, but by Kurt Cobain, who has already died, of course. And you have like these platforms now. You don't even need to prompt or anything. Like you put like 2 inputs. It's very easy to make one song and the other song, and you say, I want the timbre of this voice and this other one.
Even a genetic algorithm you can use.
But what I thought interesting about that is that
you don't need LLMs.
It can be used in a very naive way, that you're just like playing around. But this case specifically, where they put Kurt Cobain, who has already, or like his voice, to sing that specific song, that really made
It's not
sense.
mixing things. Apple and peers.
Yeah, but like it demanded a certain musical knowledge to imagine
Let
that.
me
So.
hear, Miguel. What do you think? Do you share the same opinion?
More or less.
If there's
Once
a consensus.
I was surprised by my son because he gave some prompts to ChatGPT to write a poem. But I was amazed by the poem, you know. So in a way, there was this sense of surprise, creativity. Maybe I would not have been able to write that poem. So he used ChatGPT as a tool, but something more than the tool came out of it.
But did you sign the poem, Miguel?
I could have
Did you
read.
feel the poem? It was yours?
No, it was him. It was him that wrote it.
Okay.
But I could imagine him being tricked, you know, read the
Oh,
poem.
yes.
Not at all and feel it was another human that did it. So I think you can think of it like as a tool, you know. Of course, we read now lots of master theses. Their writing improved a lot.
Yes.
Scarily, you know.
Scary.
And
Right.
sometimes you notice when they forgot to use ChatGPT in some parts. So it's a bit scary.
No Turnitin is technique.
Because, yeah, I mean, because it's a tool. Some people can use this just as a tool, but produce something that goes much beyond the tool.
Let me end with two short
Just to
questions.
add one thing to Miguel. Sometimes in a creative activity, it may be more than a tool. It may be a companion. Because we dialogue with the system. It corrects us. It gives us suggestions and so on. It's more than a tool sometimes. That depends on how we use it.
Let me end with two short questions also. Please give me also short answers, and then we'll give the floor to the public. So, first, do you think that we can train AI, our AI models, to be creative? And when I'm talking about being creative, I'm not talking about mixing things. And second, if so, do you think that this AI creativity will be better than the human creativity, and this could be the ultimate path to the strong AI that we are looking for? Or what do you want to say about this? Miguel.
I remember reading a conto, a small chapter from Isaac Asimov, where everyone went for training to get skills. And the guy thought, well, he was like the dark swan, you know, he was not selected for anything. In the end of the chapter, he was chosen because of the creativity. Because, so it was very difficult to find creative humans. Most of them were just set to get like a sheep, and then they get a skill. So I think what you're asking is alchemy. If we would have the thing to train creativity, this would be, you know, so my answer is no, I don't believe, because then you would have a recipe that would be like gold. So at the moment, I'm skeptical. That's what I mean.
And so you think that, of course, it won't be possible?
The thing is that you need to, I'm not saying it's an algorithm, but you need to create something that can invent and then get this resonance, that, you know, this pleasure, this result. So I think it's difficult. I'm not saying if somebody can train an algorithm to be creative, I mean, this would be a $1 million invention, I would say. I'm meaning a training algorithm, you know. I don't know what you think, but...
Yeah. Okay, so... well, I think to try to keep it very short, I would say that, of course, there are several implications of the questions. Like, one of them is that, you know, like, why would we need such a thing besides commercial use? Would it have any other sort of, like, say, intellectual or social or like more human-centered, so to speak, a function? Which is, of course, one question. The other one that is implied in that one. If you're talking about artistic creativity, training AI to surpass us, whatever that may mean, again, that implies like that we know very well what kind of thing we're evaluating, but our relation to art has become very problematic, especially since the 20th century. So if we define it in terms, as we have been discussing here, it gives me some pleasure or something like that, well, then that's perhaps not that difficult and it's very relative in a way or subjective. But if we try to find some more objective thing in artworks, like some sort of a more objective meaning or whatever, then that can be a different debate. But all in all, just to remind again, like the phenomenologist, Professor Carlos that spoke in the morning, I think also in this phenomenological tradition, creativity in the arts has a lot to do not only with pleasure, but also a lot to do with articulating experiences, non-conceptual experiences of time, of space, of images, and so on. And that has to do that you need to have a word, like a lived word, like in a phenomenological sense. So, and that's something very human in that sense, that it depends on our history, on our body, on how we perceive the surroundings, and how we articulate subject. Yeah.
So you think that it's not exactly, you have the same position. So
at the end of the day, the same position.
Exactly. It won't be possible to train AI to be creative.
Yes, because they are different things. One thing is algorithmic thinking, another thing is that our lived relation with the world. So.
And Milker, what is your opinion?
Well, I tend to. We know that human creativity is not the same as machine creativity, and the same way. Bad argument. Human intelligence is not the same as machine intelligence. The same happens with creativity. So machine creativity has different characteristics. It's not the same. But if we think on humans, it is possible to train humans to be more creative. This is studied 100 years ago. There were people starting to do that, and there are lots of theories and methodologies for that. Particularly at younger ages, it's quite easy to see the effect of encouraging creativity, divergence, and so on and so on.
Yes.
So, but that is, I don't see that as, well, it's a part of training, okay. But in a machine, I'm not sure this is a trainable thing. I see this, in the case of the machines, as giving our programs other resources to be able, or other approaches, other kind of algorithms that favor divergence, that favor looking for border situations, border answers. Diverge from what the others did, and so on, trying to reach different zones of the conceptual space. Okay, so it's not a matter of training, but a matter of adding something to the.
So you think that will not suffice, never will suffice human creativity?
I don't think that is an important question at all. For us, the important thing is to have programs that enlarge our creativity. That's our main concern, and that's the question.
So
is it possible
augment AI, not question of replacing?
To augment our capabilities, not to be better than us? I don't think that nobody tries to do that, and I don't know even if it is possible or not. It's not a thing that worries me.
Thank you so much. So now is time for the public questions. So please, I cannot see. Oh.
Thank you for your speech, all of you. I just have a question about pleasure in creativity, because I question if there's some kind of aesthetics that is not pleasurable, and maybe it's creative. And I want to know what you think about it, because I thought that connecting creativity only to pleasure may be restrictive. I think that some paintings and some discoveries are not pleasurable, or some kind of movies, but they are creative because they cause horror, something like intriguing or something like new, but sometimes not really a pleasure feeling. I don't know if I can help me with this.
Maybe I can make a comment on that. I agree with you. You know, there are some like mathematicians or some people even with emotion regulation disorders or perturbation, like in autism, they can have a lot of pleasure exchanging prime numbers. So there can be a sort of intellectual high-level pleasure. You know, I'm mentioning again the research of Sergio Nascimento. There is pleasure simply, I think, because people see a statistical pattern in the painting that is similar to what they see in nature. Some people just resonate with realism, and some people resonate with complex mathematical patterns that are not evolutionarily driven. So I can conceive that. So I do not disagree with you. I'm just saying, still there you have reward. Maybe you have kind of a reward in seeing these patterns. So because you have two different systems in the brain, the reward system and the emotional system, so the dopaminergic system and the amygdala system, just to be very simple. And I would say that in creativity, that the reward system is always involved. Even if there is something very abstract, like an invention, something very elegant, so very intellectual, it's a kind of intellectual reward, may not be fully emotional, but there is still the reward involved, you know. I would say that there is always a sort of recognition when you have a creative experience.
If you have an emotion as horror, that's not a horror
As
emotion. Terrifying emotion. Terror.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that I like horror movies. No problem. Actually, for me, it's a mystery, a true mystery. Why I like it, but certainly my reward system is activated. And there is some art and creativity doing. Actually, I think it's very difficult to really be creative in making good horror movies.
Or noise music. Usually people don't like noise, but there are people making music just from noise.
Yeah, and like a tonal, I'm not a music expert, but you know, some musical trends were revolutionary. You know, like many forms of conceptual art, they are intellectual, simply because they disrupt the common patterns of art appreciation.
Yes.
But I think still that can bring reward. It's like breaking the rules or...
But I was trying to organizing my thought, not to connect intrinsically creativity with pleasure. Maybe there are some kinds of creativity that are not connected with pleasure, because it seems that you are thinking that connection is intrinsic, and I don't think that, I don't know.
When I talk about reward, it's not necessarily pleasure.
Okay, now I can understand better like that.
These are different. For me, reward is like a dopamine signal that it's like a reinforcement signal. So it's just something that reinforces you to keep on the same track.
Like addiction.
In a way, there is a relation with that, but because dopamine is related with that. But so reward is not the same as pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic panel. When I think about art, I would say that art has an intention the artist is the author of his own piece of art. And AI doesn't seem to have that intention, because it's a tool in which in Midjourney or Sora, I give a prompt and then there is an output. So AI does not have the artistic will or the artistic intention. So in my point of view, which may be absolutely wrong, this destroys partly the idea that AI can create art. But my question is, recently has been discovered the problem of model collapse, okay? So the fact that when models are trained on data and then they are trained in the data they start producing the AI model collapse and giving answers and even more weirder hallucinations than what has happened. So the question is, how can AI produce art if it is prone to model collapse, and the fact that model collapse negates the possibility of an AI to be creative, aside from the fact that creation is art is an intention and AI apparently does not have it. I don't know if this question makes sense, but that was our thinking. And we must not forget that in 2016 there was the Deep Bach, which created compositions in the style of Bach, and roughly 50% of people couldn't tell the difference between real Bach and Deep Bach. But if that model starts collapsing, where is the art now? That would be my question for the panel, if it makes sense or if it's a valid and acceptable question. Thank you very much.
Well, I think it is a challenging question, and I would start to say that for me, imitating Bach is not art. Okay, so if we want to speak about art, we have to think on different approaches. It's for current generative AI is very good in imitating, but it's very bad in creating. Okay, so I frankly don't believe that current AI systems can create autonomously. They need a human to write the prompts, to filter, to curate the results, and to keep the process going iteratively. The human must be there. Otherwise, nothing is done. With current generative AI systems, I'm not speaking about current knowledge-based systems and so on that are more powerful in that concern, but they are not popular. The question here is, if we consider a generative AI program or any other kind of AI or any other kind of program, of computer program, or any technology in general as a companion of the composer, a companion of the designer, a companion of the poet, of the writer, and so on and so on and so on. If we consider it as a companion, it's a different story. It may help the human to be more creative, to go further, to explore areas that that particular human didn't think, wasn't aware it was possible, okay? So this may be really useful. That's my point about this.
Maybe I can just comment something very quickly, just to add to what Professor mentioned. Like, I would just say that also when we have these kinds of Turing tests for music or for arts, like I think another thing that we have to take into account is that we take for granted that to judge art or a artwork or an art piece, whatever, that it has to be something a bit, like this kind of market research. Let's put it out and see how many percentage of... I'm not sure if that's a given, like that's one time of insight, but it's not so clear who is apt to judge art. I'm not saying that I know. I'm not saying that it is possible to have that. I'm saying that that's a problem. How to judge that, under which criteria. Some criteria are easier, more objective. Others can be highly historically dependent. Maybe others are not so much. I don't know, but this is a debate. And so this is one point. And the other point is that, and maybe connecting with the previous question, when you comment about the intention, yes, we can think along those lines, and I agree with what you said in a way, which should lead to the hypothesis of the AI more as a tool or an instrument or even as a method, we could think in some cases. But also we can think of like human-made art as itself a type of technique, a technique of understanding the world and the others. Like we're not born to learn how to narrate or how to novel or how to music, or these were things that we learned, and this helps us articulate our experiences and coordinate intersubjectively our experiences, which has to do with intention, but not necessarily. And it also, this may be a bit what I would disagree with the colleagues, or not so much, but I would not put so much emphasis on the thing of the pleasure or even this like vague idea of aesthetic experiences. There's also this dimension of a sort of knowledge, a sort of or epistemology, if you want, that is typical of the aesthetic thinking, of musicking, of narrating, of telling stories, that is not the same as algorithmic thinking. Although you can maybe map more or less one or the other, but they're not the same kind of thinking. And in that sense, art itself has its own, like, epistemic technique, so to speak, on how to gain knowledge and share knowledge about the world, about tradition, about other works of art. And that has its own way of thinking, which is not really what AI is meant to do, it's meant to do, basically. So, yeah.
Maybe I make a very short comment. I think what you said about intentionality and feeling that there is an agent that can surprise and manipulate is very essential in the creativity and the art process. So you were mentioning pleasure, but I think just this fact of having a sort of communication with an agent that is manipulating you and creating surprise, and in music you see that a lot. Like the epic musics or musics that suggest a given emotion and then they surprise you. So I think this sense of agency that somebody is really, there is a communication and manipulating is still outside. It would be scary if AI produced music could generate this sense, this perception of intentionality. So I think that's quite important.
I agree. Intention must be there, and it's in the side of the human, not in the side of the machine.
Okay, so thank you so much. We will continue. I'm sorry, David. We will continue in the session in the coffee break. So thank you so much.
Just remembering now that we have a coffee break at Almagio's restaurant is next year. And then we'll start the parallel sessions. You can consult the topics at your flyer. Just advising you that one of the discussions, the parallel session 1 will be here in the auditorium. The parallel session 2 will be next door in the rehearsal rooms. It's as you leave the auditorium at your right. Okay, thank you.